Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Dollmaker's Workshop. Holly Arnold had always been a lover of dolls, the kind that seemed to have a life of their own. She wasn't interested in the ordinary plastic creations found in toy stores. No, her passion lay in the rare and the strange. Her collection filled every corner of her small London flat, porcelain dolls with hand-painted eyes, wooden puppets with intricately jointed limbs, and even a few rare automata that blinked and twitched when wound up. So when she heard of the reclusive Dollmaker on the Isle of Wight, she knew she had to visit. The Dollmaker was a legend among collectors, though few had met him in person. His creations were said to be the most lifelike in the world, indistinguishable from real people at a glance. They were the rarest of finds, sold only to the most discerning collectors, and always at a price that spoke to their uniqueness. No photographs existed of these dolls. Those who owned them cherished their exclusivity and guarded them jealously. Holly had never seen one, but the rumors were enough to make her curiosity unbearable. She booked a ferry for the next day, not caring about the suddenness of her decision. Her heart raced with excitement as she thought about the potential addition to her collection. When she arrived on the Isle of Wight, the air was thick with mist, lending the island an ethereal, almost otherworldly quality. The ferry ride had been quiet, save for the low murmur of other passengers and the occasional squawk of seagulls. But as soon as Holly set foot on the dock, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The directions to the Dollmaker's workshop were vague, passed on from collector to collector, each adding their own little embellishment or warning. Holly followed them carefully, navigating the narrow, winding roads of the island, flanked by dark forests that seemed to close in the farther she drove. The path eventually led her to a small, almost forgotten village nestled between two steep hills. The houses here were old, their windows dark, as if the occupants had long since abandoned them. The only sign of life was a thin ribbon of smoke curling up from the chimney of a workshop at the far end of the village. Holly parked her car and approached the workshop, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The building was old, with ivy crawling up the stone walls and moss clinging to the roof. A wooden sign hung above the door, withered and barely legible, *Stromberg's Workshop*. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron handle, before finally gathering the courage to knock. The door creaked open almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting for her. The man who stood before her was tall and thin, with sharp features that seemed almost carved from stone. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones, giving him a skeletal appearance. He wore a simple apron over his clothes, stained with the colors of his craft. "You must be Holly Arnold," he said. "I've been expecting you." Holly swallowed. "Yes, I am here to see your work." He nodded and stepped aside. The workshop was dimly lit, with a single flickering lamp on the workbench and a fire crackling in the hearth. The air was thick with the smell of wood shavings, paint, and something else she couldn't quite place, a metallic tang that made her stomach turn. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw them, dolls, lined up on shelves, seated in chairs, and propped against walls. They were all life-sized, dressed in elaborate clothing, their faces frozen in expressions so realistic it was unnerving. She felt as though she'd walked into a room full of people who had been turned to stone. "These are incredible," Holly breathed. It was a young woman with dark hair, her lips slightly parted as if she were about to speak. The detail was astonishing. Every strand of hair, every crease in her clothing, every tiny vein in her hands was rendered with perfect accuracy. "They are my life's work," the Dollmaker said from behind her. "Each one is unique, created with the utmost care and attention." Holly reached out to touch the doll's face. Something about the eyes was wrong, too glassy, too empty. She pulled her hand back, the unease growing stronger. "How do you make them?" she asked. The Dollmaker smiled, a thin, joyless curve of his lips. "It's a trade secret. But I assure you, every piece is made with the finest materials." Holly forced a smile in return. She felt the weight of the doll's eyes on her, as if they were watching her every move. "Would it be possible to purchase one?" she asked. "So of course. But first I'd like to show you something special, something not for sale, but for you to appreciate as a fellow collector." He led her to a door at the back of the workshop. Holly followed reluctantly, the dread pulling in her stomach. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. The dollmaker gestured for her to go first, and she hesitated for only a moment before beginning the descent. The steps creaked underfoot, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, the dollmaker lit a lamp, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of dolls, they held jars, dozens of them each containing something preserved in murky liquid. Holly stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what she was looking at: human organs, perfectly preserved, floating in the jars like grotesque specimens in a mad scientist's lab. What is this?" she whispered. The essence of my craft. These are the parts that give my dolls life, their hearts, their eyes, their skin, each one carefully selected, preserved, and repurposed." Holly recoiled, backing away from the shelves. "You're insane." "This is monstrous." The dollmaker's expression didn't change. "I prefer to think of it as dedication to my art. But I understand if you don't see it that way." She turned to run. He seized her by the arm, his grip like iron, and dragged her back toward the workshop. Holly struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was unnaturally strong, his bony fingers digging into her flesh-like claws. He forced her back up the stairs through the workshop, and into a side room she hadn't noticed before. The room was bare, save for a single chair in the center and a table filled with sharp, glinting instruments. Straps dangled from the arms and legs of the chair, and Holly's blood ran cold as she realized what they were for. "No, please," she begged. "Let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." He pushed her into the chair, his movements methodical, almost robotic, as he strapped her in. Holly thrashed against the restraints, but they held firm, digging into her skin. She screamed, the sound echoing off the walls, but there was no one to hear her. The dollmaker picked up a scalpel from the table, inspecting it under the light before turning back to her. His eyes were empty, devoid of any humanity, as he approached. Holly's screams grew louder, more desperate, as he brought the blade closer to her face. "Don't worry," he whispered. "You'll make a beautiful doll." The last thing Holly saw was the scalpel descending toward her. The last thing she heard was the dollmaker's whisper, and then there was only darkness. Months later, a new doll appeared in the workshop, a stunningly lifelike creation with fiery red hair, green eyes, and a soft porcelain complexion. She sat in a place of honor, dressed in a simple, elegant gown, her face frozen in an expression of serene calm. Visitors to the workshop marveled at her beauty, commenting on how she seemed almost alive. The dollmaker would smile his thin, joyless smile and nod in agreement, though he would never reveal the secret of his craft. After all, his best work was made from only the finest materials, and this new doll was his masterpiece, a creation that truly captured the essence of life. And so Holly Arnold took her place among the dollmaker's collection, forever frozen in time, her beauty preserved for eternity. Visitors admired her, never knowing that the doll they praised was once a woman who had sought only to add to her collection, only to become a part of it. The dollmaker's workshop remained as it always had been, quiet, unassuming, and filled with the most lifelike dolls anyone had ever seen. But those who entered it never quite left the same, for the workshop held secrets that would chill the blood of even the most ardent collector. And somewhere, deep within the cold, silent confines of the workshop, Holly's soul lingered, trapped within the lifeless shell that had once been her body. She was aware, in some distant, detached way, of the world around her, of the people who came and went, admiring her form, speaking in hushed tones about her beauty. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, but she felt everything. Every touch of a curious hand, every brush of fabric as she was dressed and redressed, every time her lifeless eyes were polished to a shine. Time became a blur. Days and nights melded into one another, indistinguishable in the windowless confines of the workshop. Holly's mind drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes clinging desperately to fleeting memories of her former life, and other times succumbing to the overwhelming silence that threatened to consume her entirely. But she wasn't alone. She could sense them, the others. The dolls that filled the workshop, lined up on shelves and seated in chairs, each one a prison for a soul just like hers. She could feel their despair, their silent screams reverberating through the still air. They were trapped just as she was, each one a victim of the dollmaker's twisted art. They had all been people once, with lives, dreams, and hopes, all reduced to lifeless figures in a madman's collection. Occasionally, a new doll would arrive, a fresh soul ensnared by the dollmaker's craft. Holly could feel their terror, their confusion, as they were bound to their new form, their bodies preserved and transformed into another of the dollmaker's grotesque masterpieces. She wanted to reach out to them, to offer some kind of comfort, but she was powerless, trapped in her own silent torment. The dollmaker continued his work, undisturbed and unrepentant. He moved through his workshop with the same cold precision, never acknowledging the lives he had stolen, the souls he had condemned. To him, they were merely materials, pieces to be shaped, molded, and perfected. But the dolls knew the truth. They knew the horror of what had been done to them, and they longed for release, for freedom from the prison of their artificial bodies. Yet there was no escape. The dollmaker's magic, whatever dark force he had tapped into, held them fast, binding their souls to the fragile shells that housed them. And so time passed. The workshop remained unchanged, a place of quiet, creeping dread, hidden away in the remote village on the Isle of Wight. Visitors still came, drawn by the allure of the dollmaker's creations, oblivious to the truth that lay just beneath the surface. They marveled at the lifelike dolls, at the eerie realism of their expressions, their eyes, their skin, never suspecting that what they admired was the result of the most horrific of sacrifices. But beneath the stillness, a change was stirring. The dolls began to communicate in ways that only they could understand. Their thoughts, once isolated and scattered, started to coalesce, forming a kind of collective consciousness. It was faint at first, a mere whisper in the darkness, but it grew stronger with each passing day. They had no voices, no means to speak, but they shared a common pain, a common rage that bound them together. Holly was at the center of it. Her will, her determination, had not faded with time. If anything, it had only grown stronger. She refused to let go of who she had been, of the life that had been stolen from her. Her thoughts reached out to the others, pulling them together, uniting them in their shared torment. And as their bond grew stronger, so too did their desire for revenge. It began with small things, subtle shifts in a workshop, movements so slight they could have been imagined. A doll's hand that seemed to change position when no one was looking, a head that turned just slightly more than it should have. The dollmaker noticed, of course, but he dismissed it as mere happenstance, a trick of the light or his own aging mind. After all, his creations were perfect, silent, still, and lifeless. But the dolls were far from lifeless. As their collective will strengthened, they began to exert more influence over their surroundings. The workshop grew colder, the air heavy with a palpable sense of unease. Objects would move on their own, a tool sliding across a workbench, a chair tipping over with no one near it. The dollmaker's once steady hands began to tremble, his confidence shaken by the inexplicable happenings. And then the whispers started. At first, they were barely audible, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The dollmaker would stop in his work, glancing around the room, his eyes narrowing as he tried to pinpoint the source. But there was nothing, no one but him and his dolls. He would shake his head, muttering to himself, and return to his work, but the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. They were the voices of the trapped souls, united in their suffering, demanding to be heard. Holly's voice was among them, strong and clear, urging the others on. They spoke of their pain, their anger, their desire for vengeance. The dollmaker tried to ignore them, but the voices echoed in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. Sleep became impossible. The whispers followed him even into his dreams, turning them into nightmares from which he could not escape. He would wake in a cold sweat, the darkness of the workshop pressing in on him, the eyes of his dolls seeming to watch his every move. He began to hear their voices in the silence, accusing him, mocking him. Then, one night, the dollmaker awoke to find himself unable to move. He lay in his bed, paralyzed, his body frozen in place. Panic surged through him as he struggled against the invisible force holding him down, his heart racing as he realized he was not alone. The dolls were standing around his bed, their lifeless eyes fixed on him, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Holly was at the forefront, her green eyes shining with a light that was not her own. She stared down at him, her expression cold and unyielding, her presence dominating the room. The dollmaker tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He could only watch in terror as the dolls moved closer, their limbs creaking, their hands reaching out toward him. Holly's hand was the first to touch him, her cold fingers brushing against his skin, sending a shiver of fear through his body. And then they began to take him apart. It was a slow, meticulous process, mirroring the care with which he had crafted them. The dolls worked together, their movements synchronized, their actions deliberate. The dollmaker's screams were silent, his mind trapped in a waking nightmare as his own creations dismantled him piece by piece. As they worked, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices filled with a terrible, triumphant joy. They were reclaiming what had been taken from them, exacting their revenge on the man who had stolen their lives. Holly's voice was the loudest of all, guiding the others, ensuring that the dollmaker's end was as agonizing as possible. By the time they were finished, the dollmaker was no more. His body had been reduced to a collection of parts, laid out on the bed like the pieces of a macabre puzzle. The dolls stood around him, their work complete, their vengeance satisfied. And then, one by one, they began to move again, not as lifeless dolls, but as living beings freed from the curse that had bound them. The workshop trembled with the energy of their release, the oppressive air lifting as their souls were finally set free. Holly was the last to leave, her form dissolving into the air like mist, her soul finally at peace. The workshop, once filled with the weight of countless trapped spirits, now stood empty and silent, its secrets buried within its walls. But the story of the dollmaker's workshop did not end there. The village, long forgotten by the world, remained a place of mystery and dread. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the strange lights that sometimes flickered in the abandoned building, of the eerie silence that hung over the place like a shroud. And those who dared to venture inside, foolish collectors, curious thrill-seekers, found nothing but dust and shadows, the dolls long gone, their presence erased as if they had never existed. Yet some claimed to feel a chill in the air, a sense of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. They would leave quickly, unnerved by the atmosphere, and the workshop would fall silent once more, waiting, always waiting. For the dollmaker's workshop had not been destroyed, and its dark legacy lived on. The souls it had claimed were gone, but the workshop remained a place of quiet malevolence, where the boundaries between life and death had been blurred, where the echoes of the past still lingered, whispering of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. And it waited, patiently, for the day when it would once again become a place of creation and torment, when a new dollmaker would take up the tools of the trade, and the cycle would begin anew. For evil, like art, is eternal, and the dollmaker's workshop was a masterpiece of both. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.